Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Streaming Alchemy. I'm John Mahoney, and on today's show, we're going to look at how you can use static image elements to create dynamic graphics using a range of capabilities inside of vMix. But before we get to that, I first want to welcome everybody and invite you, if you have any questions, have any comments about what we're doing, please just post them in the comments below on whichever platform you're viewing on, and we'll try to get to everything live on air here today. Also, if you'd like to join us live on the show, we do have a link in the show notes and here on the screen. So if you want to give us a call, somebody from the studio can get you on as well. So why don't we get started for today? So the first thing I'd like to do is give you a sense of what it is that we're actually going to be showing how to recreate here. So I have a session here in vMix, and the goal is that we're going to take different player elements, some statistics about the player, and do a interesting sort of dynamic motion with that. So let me show you how that will look here. So here's just a backdrop of a screen. And what I can do is I can take and move my players on screen, sort of out of focus, pushing them into focus, put their information up, then sort of push them off and move to the next player and zoom them in. So the goal here was that even though all the elements that we have in this are static, we're able to create some sort of motion and something to catch people's eye as you're going through sort of all the steps, all the team members in a roster. So this is what we're going to be working through today. So before we actually dive into the vMix preset, I know we have some comments up here, and I'd like to jump in and start to say hello to everybody here. So we have Michael. Michael, thank you for joining us. Hopefully you do find this interesting, because it's something I think it's just a slightly different spin on some of the things that we've seen in production. So hopefully you find it all useful. We have Spatial Optics. Spatial, great to have you back. Thank you for joining here. We have Vlad. Vlad, thank you for joining. Always good to see you here. So let's see. We have Samuel from Norway. Samuel, thank you for joining us, especially, from, was basically your Friday night. So definitely appreciate that. So we have Yuda Man. Thank you for joining. So we have Eric from California. Eric, thank you. Good to see you here. We have JP Unade. Hello. Thanks for joining, JP. And Vlad saying hello to everybody. So Vlad, thank you. Definitely appreciate this. Okay, so let's actually take a look, and I'll go through the vMix session because there are a few different things that we have going on here that could be interesting. So if we look at this, it is actually a pretty streamlined session. And it breaks down into, first I set up a list in vMix with all of the players. So if I came here, these are just static images of all the players here. So if I picked any of them, obviously nothing is changing with the content. I'm just going through the list here. But these are just the list of players that we have that we're going to be using for this. And you can see that what we're doing is when we do this zoom, we're taking the full body shot of these players, and then we're pushing in on that. So that's how we're handling that. So one of the things, so like if I click init here, you can see the whole screen is vacant now. And that's because of the second input we have here, which is just a player stand-in that's just blank. So we can always go and say, if I don't want to show a player on screen, we just use this blank input for them. And here's where the more interesting stuff starts. So even though I didn't need to do it, we have two elements that we have. One is for a player that the player image in focus, and the second is for the player image out of focus. We put the player image in focus in a mix. We didn't really need to do that. We could have just used the original image, but if we wanted to do any sort of processing or anything to that, that would give us the ability there to do it. The player image out of focus, this is sort of mix 2 and mix 3. Mix 1 is the main mix, always, just so we sort of keep that as a reference. So mix 2 is just the player image directly. Mix 3, though, is we use the blur effect in this. So if I come up here to effects, you can see that I have a Gaussian blur on the player. And this is what we use for that sort of push to focus effect that we do. So when I have this blurred, the counterpart over here, of course, is this, which is not blurred. So I have the ability now to sort of switch between these two. Where do we switch between them? We switch between them in mix 4. So mix 4 lets me go and say I want to use the focused or unfocused image of the player. And something to keep in mind, because this is in a mix, I'm not just switching between them. I'm actually transitioning between them. So this does a fade. So I have the ability when I do this to sort of create that sense of movement into focus, where it's not just out of focus, in focus, but by having this in a mix, I have the ability now to do that sort of turn it into focus. And we actually do the motion element of that using two inputs that we merge between. So in the first input, which I call the far input, and that's the typically one that will be the blurred image that's in the back, what we're doing is, let's go into our layers. We take the player on screen mix 4, so this is the blurred image, and we actually go and we have this sort of standard sitting there as one, so he comes in and he takes up the full screen. But for the unblurred, sort of the near image, what we're actually doing is we are moving in and taking that unblurred image at 1.75, so almost like double zoom, double resolution. And that gives us that sense of the pushing it into the camera and showing that close-up cropped view of the player on screen. Now, the last element here is we are putting the player stats up. And that's what just sort of goes over the edge of the screen here with whatever the selected player is. So how do all these elements work? So when we do, so I'm sort of show this as we talk. So let me just sort of initialize everything, and then I'll bring the player on screen, and I can sort of talk through exactly what you're seeing here now. When I do this, what you're seeing is the player is coming in blurred. And then as we move forward, it comes into focus. And the way we do this is we're doing two things simultaneously. One of them is we're doing the transition over here in mix 4 between the focused version and between the unfocused version and the focused version. So that gives us that sense of it's coming into focus as we do that transition. In parallel, we're doing the merge, which is taking from the far away image, the one that's basically set at 1, so a full res image, and we're pushing it into the one that's magnified 1.75, and that's what's giving us this here. You will notice that the image here, which is the far one, is actually unblurred, and that's because as I'm doing that transition, both the far and the near are using mix 4 as the image, and I'm just pushing it further, further closer to the camera or further away. But mix 4 is what's doing the transition between blurred and unblurred. So if I just were to go and say, let's just do this fade on mix 4, you'll see that everything has become blurred. And so both of them are working with the exact same image. And what the advantage we have here is I can just replace anything in this list. And I don't need to make copies. I don't need to make a blurred copy. I don't need to do anything special. The way this is set up is that this image, whatever it is in the list, will be rendered as a focused and a blurred image. They'll be positioned further away and nearer to the camera, and this transition will just happen. And that's happening through scripting. But in this case, it's basically just collections of shortcuts. And I think that's important because this is something which doesn't require any sort of visual basic .NET or anything like that. This is just putting shortcuts, putting sleeps to let things happen as the transitions go on. All that stuff is how we do this. And you will need to use it that way because you have things going on in parallel. So there's no easy way to do them sequentially. So hopefully that makes sense. When the way we do, so let me just sort of show this other element here as we go on. The way we put up the overlay, if you see here, when I push the player on, they zoom in and then that overlay comes on. We are doing that as a trigger on transition in. So if I go over to the near input and I go and look at triggers, you can see that on the transition in, I sort of delay it a little bit and then I push this on screen. So that puts the overlay on. And when I switch back to the far one, I actually take the overlay and move it out. So it's a fade on and fade off. So, and each of those fades take over half a second. So over that period of half a second, they fade on and off. So that creates that sort of, as this image is pushing in, beside it, the lower, or the graphics, not the lower thirds, the graphics relating to that player are also coming up on screen and they go away as we pull them out. So that's really the preset mechanics outside of the scripting. So let me see, before we get into the scripting piece, let me see if we have anybody else here. We have Hakan, thank you for joining us. Thank you for coming in from Sweden. Definitely appreciate that. Yes, Jesse's a good friend. Bill is a audio engineer, sort of definitely a top flight audio engineer. I had the pleasure of meeting a few years ago, but definitely good to have you here, Bill. Thank you. So, okay, so we're not getting comments in from Facebook. Facebook is our problem child streaming service sometimes, so unfortunately we don't have that. But Ken Benedict came in and said hi, so I just want to make sure we give a shout out to Ken. Thank you for joining us, Ken. Definitely appreciate it. So we have Michael is asking if we could show this again, but in full screen mode. Sure, if you're looking for doing the output, the video output, I can certainly walk through that again in full screen mode. So let me see. So let me just sort of re-init everything and go back. So when I'm pulling this player on, you can see they come in blurred. And then once I switch over to the transition for the merging between the two near and fars, I am triggering this element here as an overlay with the details on that. So that's basically how this is working. If I do this for going off, I'm sort of just doing the reverse. If I take the next player, I'm just pulling the existing player off, bumping up to the next row in the list and to the next row in the data set, and pushing that information back on. So that's how we're working with this. And then just pulling everything off just does that as a single pull and doesn't change. So if I pull the player back on, I still have the same player there with that same model. But hopefully that covers what you were looking for. Okay, do we have, so, okay, so, okay, Michael, thank you. Always happy to go into anything in more detail. That's the point here, is to sort of share what we're doing. Okay, so the next thing, which makes sense, is probably let me go and show a bit about the player data. So I have that sitting over here. So we'll jump over to that now. So let's see, is he... All right. So here's the XML that we're using for the player, and I'll show how that's sort of integrated in vMix in a moment. But so we just set this up with each of the different players in here. So we call them all-stars. So these would be our all-star team. And then we have each one of the players with their sort of name, their team, their position, and their jersey number. So not particularly great or creative information, but I just wanted to have something, that we could demonstrate this with. And so for each one of the players in the list, we have these set up to be rows of XML data that correspond to the player in the list. So, this is the second one in the list, and so that's the second data set that we have here. But it's very straightforward, simple XML. If I go over to vMix, I can show you how we pull this in the data source manager. So if we come here, the way we have this set up, sort of go in here, we have all stars. That's what we said this was. So we have this set up so that we point to the file, which is here in our system here. And the XPath for that is we want to get as rows everything that is in the all stars, and then that's listed as player. So this basically XPath design is saying take everything in the XML block of all stars and create rows out of each element that's named player. And that's exactly what we have here. So we're looking, if you remember the XML, this was everything that was inside of each one of the player blocks. So it's their name, team, position, and number. And so we have these coming in as rows. And because of that, it's very easy now for us to say, go to row 3, go to row 5, or go to the next row, or go to the previous row. And fortunately, we have that exact same ability inside of list. So this means that I can say to both of them, go to the first row in the list, go to the first row in the data set, and then just say go to the next rows, and they'll move up together. So we use that in the scripting that we do, but that's essentially how we keep everything coordinated. We have the data source set up as a set of rows, and we have the list set up effectively as a sort of individual rows with each player image. All right. So I guess let's start with the scripting then. So we'll come over here. Let me slide this over so we can move across. And the first thing you noticed I did was I would do an initialization, which basically put everything back at a known starting state, pointing both the data rows and the player list to the first element in both, and then going through and making sure that everything I needed for doing that sort of zoom in to focus model would be working here. So we set up first Mix 4, and this is one of those things that can be very confusing in vMix. Some elements in vMix are 0-based and others are 1-based. Mixes are 0-based. So Mix 1, that what we externally talk about as your first mix, that's actually in scripting, that's Mix 0. So to make this Mix 4, we're actually saying Mix 3 because it's Mix 0, Mix 1, Mix 2, Mix 3. The fourth mix is Mix 3. So what we're saying to that is, so take and in what we would show in Mix 4, which is what we initially have in sort of that near and far inputs. It's just whatever's coming out of Mix 4. So we turn around and say, just set that to the blank plate. We don't want to show anything on screen. In the preview input, though, which is sort of for the same mix, we have mix is a full switchable special input. You have a preview and an output. So on that preview, what you do is say, I want to take output I want to assign input 4 which if you remember is the blurred player, because that's where we start with them. We start blurred and we push it into focus. So that's how we're doing that. So that's what we initialize. These sleeps, this is not what I would consider sort of great coding style. But what we're doing by putting these sleeps in here is we're just making sure that when I assign this to an element in the input, I give it time to sort of happen in vMix and to make sure it's all set before we do anything. So this is really just a way of making sure that we're not running ahead in the script of where vMix actually is in terms of state. Because we're not reading these things. This is, again, I'm trying to use just standard shortcut calls here as just a combined script full of shortcut calls. So that gets our Mix4 set up and ready to go. We then set up the source and data, the source row and the player image list. So we basically say, make sure we don't have that overlay on with any of the player data. And now let's go and set this to the first element in the data source and the first element in the list. Again, this is that confusing thing. The first element in a data source is element 0. And the way you assign this, you say select data source select row, you give it the general name, then that it's the XML, which is sort of the way it's identified, and then the row that you want. So this is row 0, but if I do a list and I select index, which is how you select an element in a list to make it active, I'm going to say it's number 1. So again, this 0 for data, 1 for the elements in the list. So a little bit confusing potentially, but that's just the way vMix is set up. And so now we've taken down the overlay, and we've set them both to put into the first player, and the first player's data. And then what we do is we basically get everything set and put the, for the main mix, we go and put the blurred input as our ready in program, and then we put the near focused in preview. So what this will do, because if you remember, we are using the blurred and the unblurred. So what we're actually setting up here is right now input 6, because it has as a layer Mix4. So not to be confusing, but Mix4 is now the blank. That's what we set it up for in the beginning. If you remember up here, we said, okay, just be the blank player. And what we're going to do is we're going to transition in. And when we do that transition in, we're going to be putting the blurred player in there, and we're going to push in, and then we'll have the switch over to the focus player right after that. But this is everything now set up for what we need to do to get started. So when we want to bring a player on, so let me sort of go here. This is the next script we have. Again, it's really pretty straightforward. So what we're doing now is we're telling the system to fade in. So we're fading from the blank player, which is where we set everything up on the initialization. We fade from the blank player up to the blurred player. So that's that first step where you see the player appear on the screen, but all blurred. Then we give it enough time for that to happen. And then in the preview input now, we're putting Mix 3, which is the focus, the player in focus. That's Mix4, actually, Mix4 in the vMix session. And that's the player in focus. We wait for that to happen, and then we do this transition on 2 levels. The first one is we do the merge, and we do that over a duration of 1200 milliseconds, so like 1.2 seconds. We do this merge, and that is moving the image from far away to zoomed in. And that's how we do this, so that those 2 sort of shift in focus. And we fade between the blurred and the focus. So that's exactly what you see happening on screen. We start to go forward, and it moves as at the same time that merge is happening, where it's moving the image forward. it's actually transitioning what that image is between a blurred and a focused version of it. And that's what we're doing in the scripting here. And again, all of these things here are basically just shortcuts. And the basic format for a shortcut is these are the same arguments you would see if you set this up just as a standard shortcut in vMix. You frame it by saying API.function, and then you give it the shortcut name in quotes. And then all of these here would be, whether it's a mix, whether it's a value, whether it's an input, these are the same values you would fill in a standard shortcut. The scripting lets us combine these and do these types of things where we have to do multiple steps or have steps happen concurrently. So that's what we're able to do here. So to bring the player off screen is very similar. We are basically going back and saying, let's put the blank player back in there and our mix 4. And then we are doing a fade to that blank player to, basically, shift back to the blank player inside of what we see on screen. And then we do the merge, which is sort of as this happens, we pull that back and we set up our preview input to, show the mixed input of the, as a preview of the blur. So this is all we're doing. We're sort of moving this back and forward to make this happen. And that's pretty straightforward. The only other thing that I really would like to cover is I wanted to have a way so we could easily drop the current player and then move to the next player, because that, as opposed to having to pull each player on and off individually, I wanted a single button push for doing this. And really, this is just a combination of things. We sort of, this is how you'd push, the player off and put the next on. And so all we're doing here is, we are doing everything we did with player off to sort of pull them out, put the blank player in, get the preview with the blurred player ready. And then we basically go and say, go to script and put the next player on. So it's pretty much exactly what we did before with the player on. The only difference with putting the next player on is we bump up to the next item in our list, and we go to the next row in our data source. And then we're basically doing exactly the same thing. We're doing sort of the fade between the blurred and the sort of the blank and the focus and the blurred, and then we move through and sort of do the push and everything else. So that's all here. These scripts are all online, so you'll be able to get them and try this all out yourself, as well as the preset. But we thought this was just a different way to start to work with graphics. And I think there could be lots of different use cases for this. And another one, which is something that I've seen a few times, not done this way exactly, but where you may actually just have an audio interview taking place, but you want to put something up where it could work in a, on something like YouTube or Facebook. This is something where you could trigger this transition between sort of which one is blurred and which one is in focus based on audio. So you could have audio coming in, and you could turn around and have a static image of the person that's speaking, and that could move from blurred to focus, and the other person could move from focus to blurred and back and forth. So you could create something that, again, it may not be for something like we're doing with sports, but it could give you that same visual dynamic to draw the person and say, I know exactly who's talking here and I know exactly who's talking there. And it's making it very clear which the speaker is, but in a very subtle way, where you're now sort of doing that rack focus style as opposed to this slide-in focus. This is where, the one goes blurry, the other is clear, and the other goes clear, and the other is blurry, which actually is very good because that's exactly what's happening here as I do this. You can sort of see that we have that shift in focus from that. So hopefully everybody found this interesting. Let's see. Let's go back and we'll jump in and see if we have any more comments, and then we can wrap up to the post show. So automation for vMix, thank you for joining us. Great to have you here. So John Simon, So John said he was under the impression that the blur effect used many resources. Could we accomplish the same effect with a blurred and focused version in the graphics and call upon them separately? So the short answer is certainly you could do that. I mean, you'd need to basically keep sort of two lists and do that and have blurred images. But I believe with static images, it isn't constantly applying this. If you were doing something with video and you wanted to do that sort of blur thing, that would definitely require a lot of overhead. So I believe with static images, this should be okay. I haven't seen anything where it appeared to demand a lot of resources. And that was one of the things I actually was thinking about with doing this with just static, but still creating sort of that dynamic. So you certainly could do this with dual list, where right now I had sort of, in this setup, I had mix 2 and mix 3 be the focused and the unfocused. You could, instead of doing that, you could just turn around and have list 1 and list 2 be, focused and unfocused and work from there, and it effectively work identically here. So, okay. Could the image be loaded too via the XML? Yes. So I did this as a list because I just thought that was a little bit easier, but you could certainly do this with the XML where you could just extend it. And that would, that would save with some of the coordination stuff where you'd know that whatever data set you're in, you had the right image to go with that. So it would prevent that potential out of sync. But again, it would work identically. You would be pulling that image in. You would probably have to do that as into some type of title and sort of then use it that way. But certainly that's a possibility to set that up. I really hadn't looked at specifically the details behind doing that, but I think that should be fine. So yeah, and just in order to keep things in sync, I mean, this is just something we did. That is always an issue, that anytime you don't have something that's sort of locked together, where an action in one forces the mirror in the other. So really, as opposed to where I talk to two separate sources and try to keep them locked together by an external control, it's much easier if I have something where in the first source, I use something in there to reference the second source. So that's clearly something that, I would do if I were doing this for a professional use case where I needed to, make sure this thing would not break or get itself sort of out of sync ever. So yes, even though we did it this way, it is something that you definitely, if you were going to use this is more of a proof of concept show where I want to show what you could do with this, but certainly it is something that, there are multiple ways to do, and I would probably pick something that forced that lock to happen. So anytime this came up, it took information from here and used that to make the other thing happen, as opposed to me externally just pointing both things to it. So yeah, Whit is mentioning, Udaman is mentioning that he loves this. He does hockey broadcasts. Yeah, I've seen some of the things that you has done, and that's definitely, hopefully that would be something that you could think about, adding in. And again, some of the stuff, you may not, it may be too exaggerated for what you want, but some of these things could be, definitely, maybe you don't want that same motion, but you just want it to sort of go from a slightly blurred to a more focused with the data up. So different things to do with this, but hopefully it just got you thinking about some possibilities for the production. All right. Yes. So spatial. Thank you. The vMix 27 has a lot of interesting things that are coming in it. And I know a lot of people, are, focused on different things that are of a particular interest to what their production style is. But the thing that excites me the most is supposedly there are some 150 new shortcuts. And to me, when somebody says a new shortcut, means new scripting possibilities. So that's definitely something there. And yes, what I think they've done is they've moved more capability into the way layers work. So layers work much more like GT title with the ability to do alignments and cropping and other things that you can do. I think that stuff is now coming into GT, into layers, as opposed to just being sort of centered in GT title. And, the visual aspects to that, the ability to do things that you can visually look at and line up, as opposed to just doing math on paper, setting values. So that's something that's definitely very useful. What does the list of players look like? Is it a drop-down list? Also, what in-ear monitor are you using? Okay. So the list of players, if I come over here and show you, all I have is I set, actually, let me jump over to the vMix session because it might be a little easier here. So when I have this set up as a list, the way a list works is if you edit the items in here, so slide this over a little bit. So these are all of the items in a list. And so if I wanted to add something or jump to the next one or anything like that, I could just go here and do an add, which puts up a browse. So I could just take and add somebody new to the list. And I could take and select anybody and remove them from the list. So all of that is sort of just very controllable all from the interface. The XML basically mirrors this. But as we sort of pointed out before, if I made some quick change to this, I could have these two out of sync. So if I came in here and threw in another player in the middle, and I didn't do the same thing over on the XML side, we could be out of sync there. So that's why when I mentioned this would probably be something where in the XML, I would specifically point to which element in the list this XML data set was associated with, and use that to select a specific item in the list, as opposed to sort of resetting them and just doing next to step through them synchronously. But that's how we handle that. So in terms of the in-ear monitors, these are just Shures. I think they're like 270s or something. So nothing particularly high end, but the way we have this set up is that I am using this off of the computer, and I am getting a Dante feed back that is being fed out my in-ear monitor, and that actually connects me multiple places. So if we have a call-in guest, I can hear the call-in guest. The operator can also jump in and sort of send something up this feed. So I have, the ability with Matt or Joe, whoever is working things, they're able to come and just tell me that I just said something very stupid, or I didn't understand a question or something, which helps keep me on track. So I definitely appreciate those interjections in the in-ear monitors to keep me on the right path here. But everything here is pretty basic stuff. This is not a special pack. I will say that we do have a whole Shure wireless return, but we actually found this was just easier since I don't need wireless when I'm just at the desk. So we'd only use that if I were doing something where I was standing and needed to be mobile. Otherwise, it's just coming off the computer on the desk. So Spatial was saying what would be really cool is adding a reference file in scripting so that you could save all the functions in one file. Yes. So here's the biggest issue in general with vMix scripting, and I've touched on this a few times in the past. You don't have functions inside vMix scripting. What you end up with is vMix scripting, to a certain extent, is like one big function. And it just sort of sits there and goes, if I want to run a script, I can call that script from vMix as if it were a function, and it does things. but it isn't set up technically so that I could create my own functions in there and just import them. And that is the limitation, because what you're really talking about, Spatial, to a certain extent, is creating libraries and being able to import the libraries I want for any particular production and to sort of string those together with some basic scripting to make this all work. And that's what I'd really like. That is the reason we did some things in the past with Node.js. Node.js doesn't run inside of vMix. It needs its own sort of workspace to run in, but it can access everything inside of vMix. So it can work with all the vMix XML, it can work with all the shortcuts, but it has all of these advantages. I can create libraries, I can create functions inside and call those functions from sort of a main line of logic in the code. So it gives you a lot of functionality for that type of scripting control. So if I were to suggest something, that would probably be, from a serious production point of view, I'd probably say, look at Node.js and start to look at that as a way to build up your toolkit and then run all of this functionality from something like Node.js. And you can still control it from vMix. And this is the important piece, because I have, I can create a key that sets a dynamic value. And this is how we do it. If you look in vMix, that's how we sort of do that action and function loop that we put in the background. You could do the same thing, except instead of scripting inside of vMix, reading that in a loop, you just have your Node.js function reading that in a loop. And when it sees a value come in to a dynamic value, it can go off and execute functionality. So you have the same thing, but with a lot cleaner way to manage the code, across productions. So hope that makes sense. So, Bill, you're quite welcome, Bill. So, all right. So it appears I've ruined John's weekend. So yeah. I mean, John says that he's been working on a set of titles, coming from Google Sheets, and Google Sheets is a perfectly fine way to bring in. I just used XML because it was sort of simpler to do. But if you bring in data from Google Sheets, that would be something where, again, coming back to the point that Michael was making before about, could you actually point to the graphics inside of something, you were doing in the XML. This is probably be exactly the way I would do this. I would probably have some URL or URI reference inside of Google Sheets so that all of it could be managed external from vMix. And all I'd really need to do is have a way to use that sheet to populate the graphic. And so I think that would probably be the biggest difference if I were using Google Sheets, especially because you can use that from a remote location. So if you put in a generic URL that could be web addressable, you could put the graphics up in one place, populate the Google Sheet, and do that all remotely from your vMix production, and just use that to pull in and control everything you saw here. All right, Eric, thank you for commenting here. So Eric says he's learning a lot, so I thank you for taking the time to be with us. That's really makes everybody here excited that to know that this is adding value somewhere. So, and he says he has an earnest request for a VB, a basic VB with vMix scripting show that goes over all of this. So yeah, so actually, Eric, I think you may have posted this on one of the YouTube or Facebook, I think. And I did get back. I think that's an excellent idea. So in looking back at sort of vMix scripting part 2, which was where I started to go into more of the visual basic side of vMix scripting, I left out a lot of sort of the context around how all of these elements fit together. And I think it would definitely be worth, revisiting this and some future shows to specifically cover what you're asking for here, that on-ramp to go from just using the shortcuts to actually using VB.NET inside the vMix context. So how all the different elements within vMix and within VB.net could all work together. So thank you for suggesting. I think that's a great suggestion here. Okay, so also we have Thomas from Germany says hello on Facebook. Thomas, I apologize. We're not getting Facebook comments in here for some reason, but I appreciate you dropping a comment. Definitely also appreciate you joining the show here from Germany. So thank you. So let's see. I'm glad, Spatial, thank you. I mean, I'm glad you find what we're doing helpful. And I think that the most gratifying thing sort of from this side is if it actually makes a difference in the productions people do, because we don't really use a lot of these things in true real world productions. They're more proof of concept types of things that we share. But I think seeing them move from that proof of concept into something that somebody crafts into an actual production of doing is really a lot of fun for us. And that's one of the things that keeps us going here. So thank you, Spatial. All right. So I think we are probably at a good point to wrap up and jump to the post show. So I'm glad that I could be here this week because I know that I wasn't sure at the beginning of the week. We had a lot going on, but so we had time to do the show. So very happy about that. We expect to be doing a show next week as well. So if you can't join us for the post show, please, take care, and we will see you next week. If you can, I'll see you in a minute. Take care, everyone. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the post show. I was just checking on comments over here. So Vlad was asking, do I think the 4 dynamic inputs are not enough? So let me flip this around because there's 2 sides. This is sort of referencing, I think, last week's show where we talked about the dynamic variables that are available inside vMix. So there are 2 classes of variables inside vMix. One is dynamic values and the other is dynamic inputs. So dynamic inputs can be used in shortcuts. So you can say, which input do I want this shortcut to act on? But then I can create a whole set of shortcuts that will do different functions to that input. In the past, because I didn't have a way to do that, what I needed to do was I needed to go and create a unique shortcut for each one of the functions multiplied by the number of inputs. So I'd actually have to specify a specific input in a function when I did executed the shortcut. Dynamic inputs allow me to set a variable that says I want to use input 6 as dynamic input 1. And then everywhere in my shortcuts, I just reference dynamic input 1, and it'll say, okay, right now that's input 6, and it will do the shortcut against input 6. Typically, I don't think you need that many dynamic inputs. They give us 4. I think we probably have more than enough dynamic inputs. Dynamic values, which is the other part of the dynamic variable equation here, dynamic values, that's one of those things where you just love to have that scratch pad where you can keep adding different things that you want to use because that's the only way to pass values between shortcuts or one instance of the shortcut to the next instance of it because you can read that value. So that's where I think having more could be really handy. But that being said, one of the things that I did sort of look at was using XML. Since it's just text, I can store it in a dynamic value and pull it out and manipulate that using scripting. So it means that I can take the 4 dynamic values that are there and use them to store lots of data. I could have team stats. I could have everything just sort of sit in one dynamic variable and pull that out and leverage all of that. So hopefully that sort of clarifies. I think we're fine with dynamic inputs. Dynamic values would definitely be nice to have more, but there are ways to get around that. As well as I mentioned, using the dynamic inputs, because from a scripting point of view, it's just a placeholder with text. How vMix uses them is different. So if you set up a shortcut, the dynamic input is very different from a dynamic value. But in terms of, it's just a storage place for strings that I can use from a script point of view. So I do sort of have more if I'm not using the dynamic inputs from a scripting point of view. Okay. This is a vMix 27 question. With AV1 support, could it be combined with SRT? For example, sending more high-end stream from the field to a vMix offsite mega bandwidth. So there's two different elements here. So AV1 is a codec, and SRT is a transport wrapper. So to sort of clarify this, what a codec does is a codec takes a video stream that comes in and it encodes it typically into something that's lower bandwidth to be sent somewhere. SRT is the wrapper that does the transport. And what SRT does, it basically says, take whatever this package of information you want me to deliver is, give it to me. I will wrap it in this transport protocol, and I'll send it over to a destination. And it is handling all of the, this packet didn't arrive, or this arrived out of order, or any of that stuff. And it takes on the other end, gets all those sequenced correctly, and then it basically unloads the package that it carried out the other end, and that moves down the pipe. So when we talk about AV1 would be something that would be packed up and potentially wrapped inside of SRT, moved to another location, and then sent out. And where you see this is there are different redistributors. Anybody that sort of does that, like whether it's YouTube or Facebook or I don't know. There are others out there that are taking a feed to act as a CDN around. They are giving you a transport, which is traditionally RTMP or RTMPS, and they're using H.264, which is the equivalent to the AV1. It's a codec to encode the video, transport it RTSP or RTMP, and unpack it on the other side to encode the different video resolutions and stream those. So hopefully that made sense. I do not know if vMix is going to give you a way to generically encode using AV1 under SRT, because I haven't played with any of the early releases of 27 yet. I don't have a copy of that, so I can't talk to it specifically. But if they do, this is exactly how it would work. The video would be encoded in AV1 and it'd be transported with SRT. So that would give you exactly what you're looking for, the ability to take something highly compressed with high quality and move that to a remote location in a transport that sort of ensures delivery quality within a given period of latency. Hope that makes sense. Spatial, thank you. I definitely appreciate that. And Spatial saying he's linking this channel on his channel. So thank you. That's definitely appreciated here. Vlad is saying he thinks more dynamic inputs will be useful for less scripting, and also useful for activators. Yeah, I agree. In that sense, you could use that for other things like that. Activators are something that clearly there are some nice things in there. I'd love to have more control over activators. So I'll have to see if there are any changes to that part of vMix 27, because activators, even though we sort of relate them to shortcuts, they are sort of separate elements inside of vMix. I would do something, and based on a state, I will do an activator, but they really work independently. And I could use activators simply to say, if if I have record on or if I have stream on, I just want to show a little light on my stream deck. The button doesn't have to do anything. It can simply be something that I use that way. So yeah, there could certainly be some ways to leverage more of all of these things. So yeah, I think it's anything that gives you more options. And especially, I understand to not have to go into sort of a deep dive into scripting on some things that we'd all like to do sort of quickly. Those things would be great to have. So, yep, agree with you there. So, I'm sorry, I'm probably not going to say the name correctly, so I apologize in advance. Vakyeslav. So hopefully I've come close. Thank you for joining us. I definitely appreciate it. So hey there, back. Thank you. All right. So this was something that I wasn't sure we were going to be able to do a show this week, and when I was thinking of different things that we could put together, one of the thoughts that I initially had was around rack focus. And if you've seen rack focus, it's that element where you have two subjects on screen and one moves out of focus and one moves sort of into focus. And it happens at the same time, where you're sort of pushing one out and pushing one in at the same time. And when I looked at that, I said, I mean, that would not in and of itself be a particularly compelling show. But then I thought of it in terms of sort of doing something with graphics. So that's how we sort of ended up with, saying I sort of push in, so I slide the element into the focal plane. And that was the thinking, where if I took something and made it look like when it was here, it was outside the plane of focus, and then as I slid it in, it got into the plane of focus and just, snapped into sort of a crisp view. So that was the thinking, and then I added all the other elements around that. But the interesting thing here is that we are using in this a lot of different vMix components. We're using list, we're using the effect, we're using inputs with the merge to move between them. We're using multiple mixes to do all the different things we want, and we're doing things with concurrency. So, I have two things kicking off together, which are part of the scripting piece, and, throw in, for good measure, data source manager with titles. So I thought it was going to be an interesting combination of things. So hopefully by keeping it just into shortcut style scripting, that made it useful to more of you as well. You don't necessarily want to jump full-fledged into VB.NET scripting. So Michael is saying, how would you envision replacing pictures with very short videos of the players in an efficient memory storage way? So I would have to look at exactly how vMix handles storage with videos. My guess is that it's sort of queuing them up, that there may be some period of time where it will have a buffer with a certain number in it, and then when I switch to it, it would have it ready, but it would have to read other ones off. I don't know, so I sort of highlight that up front. My guess is that if it were videos, it's probably pulling it in and sort of almost streaming it off the disk to get it in. So that would probably be the way. It's reading it in and playing it back, and with the thinking that if it knows it can read it in fast enough, it'll play it on screen for you. This would work the same way. To the point, though, I'm not sure if it was Vlad or somebody else mentioned about the overhead of doing the blur effect or any one of the effects. On video, that would be much higher. So sort of keep that in mind. So this may be one of those cases where you'd want to render the blurred the same way if you were doing something like this. So that's a possibility. The goal with doing the statics was that this is something where I could take and put a whole new team of people together for next week's game, and it could just happen. I just sort of say, here's my list of people that I want to have for this, and sort of run through it, and then I change the XML to match with that. So that was the thinking here, where you don't have to render things in advance. But if you have a powerful enough system, this would be something I'd sort of say, try it and see if it does what you want, because it may just require that render time for that one video. And once it's up and it's not there, you may turn around and say, that's it. I ran through the video, did that transition, and now the video stopped. And that was something, as a spike, a production spike, my system can handle, as opposed to saying where I put this on a camera that's coming in, and that whole thing now is just continuously trying to blur the camera or blur a long video that's playing over an extended period. My guess is for short videos, you'd probably be fine. All right. JP, thank you. I just appreciate everybody making the time to be here. So there's no thanks needed on your end. This is something I'm definitely grateful for. So, all right then. I think we've probably covered most things. Oh, we have another comment in here, I think. So I just saw it out the corner of my eye. It's a show suggestion here. So how to pull in NDI from Adobe Tools, where another team member does work on the fly. Yep, that's another good thing. So let me add that, NDI plus Adobe. Okay, always welcome the suggestions on these things. So let's see. So Vlad is also mentioning he's. So he says he's happy to see the Zoom integration in vMix 27, and he added, something Zoom integration into vMix Social, but nobody gave the +1. So I am surprised that they added it in vMix 27. Yeah, I mean this could definitely be interesting. There are definitely cases where Zoom is a excellent tool given the logistics of working with a particular set of guests. I definitely see that in certain heavily locked down corporate industries where that could be a real advantage. So that definitely interesting to see this come out, and I think it's going to be a very useful feature for a lot of people. So thank you. All right then, thank you, as I say. Grateful on this side for everybody taking the time to join us. So we're going to call it a wrap for today. So thank you all. Thank you for hanging out for the post show. And until we see you next week, be well. Take care.